Imagine a woman standing alone at the edge of a vast palace room long after the servants have withdrawn, the lamps dimmed, the echoes of footsteps finally gone. The crown has been set aside. The jewels are locked away. What remains is not an empire, but a human being breathing in the quiet after command. Outside these walls, an entire world believes it knows her. Inside, the silence presses back. For most of her reign, the public image was carefully composed and endlessly repeated. She was duty incarnate, a symbol of stability in an age of upheaval, the maternal figure of a global empire that stretched beyond maps and comprehension. Portraits showed composure. Ceremonies displayed order. Every gesture was measured, every appearance controlled. The crown did not merely rest on her head, it defined her existence. To the public, she was permanence itself. Yet permanence demands a price. Absolute authority does not remove fear, it refines it. Power does not eliminate vulnerability, it conceals it behind ritual. From the earliest days of her rule, expectations closed in like walls. She was young, female, scrutinized, and sovereign. Every decision carried consequence, every hesitation interpreted as weakness. The throne did not wait for maturity or comfort. It demanded obedience even from the one who sat upon it. The court became a theater where silence was currency. Words spoken too freely could ruin careers, provoke scandal, or destabilize fragile balances of influence. The queen learned quickly that restraint was not merely virtue but survival. Trust was selective. Privacy was rare. Emotional openness became a liability. The public saw a monarch who ruled with calm certainty. Few noticed how tightly that calm was held in place. Behind the ceremonial surface, the machinery of empire was relentless. Reports arrived daily, thick with suffering, conflict, and moral compromise. Decisions made in ink carried weight measured in lives. Distance softened responsibility in appearance, but not in conscience. To govern meant choosing which suffering was acceptable, which injustice could be ignored, which silence would be maintained. These choices were not made once, but endlessly. The myth of serenity depended on separation. The queen was elevated, physically and symbolically removed from ordinary existence. This distance protected the institution, but it also isolated the individual. Conversations were filtered. Emotions were managed. Even grief had its protocols. There was little space for doubt and less for vulnerability. To show uncertainty would be to invite instability. To reveal fear would be to weaken the crown. And yet fear did not disappear. It learned to live quietly. It took residence in the private hours, in the pauses between duties, in the unspoken awareness that authority could not shield against loss. Power could command loyalty, but it could not guarantee love. It could enforce obedience, but it could not prevent abandonment. The more absolute the authority, the more personal the isolation. The public adored consistency. The queen provided it relentlessly. Decade after decade, she embodied continuity in a changing world. Industrial transformation, political unrest, colonial expansion, and moral contradictions unfolded beneath her reign. Each upheaval increased the need for a stable figure at the center. That stability required sacrifice. The image could not fracture, no matter the strain behind it. Within the court, expectations hardened into routine. Deference was automatic. Disagreement was cautious. Even intimacy was shaped by hierarchy. Those closest to the throne were never entirely free from calculation. Affection and ambition existed side by side, difficult to separate. The queen understood this. Trust became measured. Relationships were monitored not only for loyalty, but for risk. The private world narrowed. Duty consumed time and emotion alike. Silence became habitual, not merely imposed but internalized. Speaking less meant revealing less. Revealing less meant maintaining control. Control was safety, or so it seemed. Over time, the habits that protected authority also constrained humanity. The queen's inner life was increasingly contained, disciplined, subdued. The empire demanded confidence. Parliament demanded resolve. The public demanded reassurance. There was no room for visible collapse. Even sorrow had to be managed carefully, displayed only in acceptable forms at appropriate moments. Grief was acknowledged, but never allowed to overwhelm function. Pain was permitted only insofar as it did not disrupt order. Yet pain accumulates whether acknowledged or not. The cost of constant restraint is not immediately visible. It appears slowly, in emotional withdrawal, in rigid patterns of behavior, in the inability to release control even when it no longer serves. The crown teaches endurance, but it does not teach healing. Silence preserves appearances, but it does not resolve suffering. The Queen. En's authority extended into every corner of her realm, but it could not extend inward without consequence. To rule an empire is to become a symbol, and symbols are not permitted the full range of human expression. The role consumes the person. Over time, it becomes difficult to remember where one ends and the other begins. Those who observed her from afar saw only the surface, a sovereign unshaken by time, a ruler whose presence suggested order and moral certainty. Few asked what that certainty cost. Fewer still were permitted to see the private weight of expectation, the emotional discipline required to maintain the illusion of control. The cracks did not announce themselves loudly. They appeared subtly, in withdrawal from public life, in intensified attachment to routine, in a deepening reliance on familiar patterns and trusted voices. Change became threatening. Novelty became unsettling. The world beyond the palace walls grew louder and more chaotic, while the inner world grew quieter, more constrained. Power had protected her from many dangers, but it had also sealed her within a narrow emotional landscape. The very structures designed to uphold the crown began to confine the person beneath it. Silence, once a tool, became a condition. Obsession with order replaced flexibility. Fear of instability shaped decisions, both public and private. The first fracture was not visible to the crowds. It occurred in private, where authority offered no refuge, a moment when duty could not fully suppress emotion, a realization that the crown demanded more than obedience, it demanded surrender, not of power, but of self, and once that realization took hold, it could not be unlearned. The empire would continue, the image would endure, but something within the private world had shifted. A quiet imbalance had formed, barely perceptible, yet impossible to ignore. The silence that once protected now concealed something unresolved. And from that silence, consequences would begin to emerge. The silence did not arrive suddenly. It thickened over time, shaped by habit and reinforced by reward. Each moment of restraint was praised as dignity. Each withheld emotion was interpreted as strength. The Queen learned that composure was not simply expected, it was essential. The machinery of power responded best to stillness, not reflection. Calm preserved confidence. Distance preserved authority. Her private world adjusted accordingly. Rooms were arranged for efficiency rather than comfort. Schedules replaced spontaneity. The day was divided into segments of obligation, leaving little space unclaimed by duty. Even moments meant for rest were carefully managed, bounded by routine. The crown did not sleep, and neither, it seemed, could the mind that carried it. Those around her adapted to the rhythm. Advisors spoke cautiously, servants moved quietly. Familiarity existed, but it was controlled, regulated by rank and expectation. Affection was present, yet it remained formal, shaped by protocol. True emotional intimacy was difficult to maintain when every interaction carried consequence. The Queen was always observed, even when alone. The public myth grew stronger as the private self receded. Newspapers praised her restraint. Artists captured her composure. The image hardened into something almost immovable. This stability became reassurance for a society navigating rapid change. The more uncertain the world felt, the more necessary her constancy appeared. The myth demanded reinforcement, and she supplied it faithfully. Yet stability can become confinement. The very qualities that preserved authority also restricted expression. Doubt was rarely voiced. Frustration was rarely released. The pressure did not vanish, it accumulated. Each decision, each act of control added another layer to the private burden. Power insulated her from challenge, but it did not shield her from consequence. Within the palace, conversations often ended before reaching uncomfortable truths. Silence smoothed over disagreements. Avoidance replaced confrontation. This was not weakness, it was strategy. Conflict threatened unity, and unity sustained the throne. But unresolved tension does not dissolve. It lingers, shaping behavior, influencing judgment in ways difficult to trace. The Queen's relationship with control deepened. Order offered predictability. Predictability offered safety. Any deviation from routine felt disruptive, even dangerous. Change required energy she rarely had to spare. The world beyond her control expanded daily, yet within her reach, she tightened boundaries. Authority over others was matched by discipline imposed upon herself. Public ceremonies became both shield and burden. They reaffirmed her position while demanding flawless performance. Each appearance required preparation, emotional containment, and precision. The ritual never acknowledged fatigue. The crowd never saw hesitation. The Queen delivered certainty because certainty was demanded. But private grief, when it came, tested these boundaries. Loss does not respect protocol. It intrudes, unsettles, demands acknowledgement. Yet even sorrow was shaped by expectation. Mourning could not disrupt governance. Emotion could not eclipse function. The Queen grieved within limits, her pain contained by necessity rather than choice. Isolation intensified quietly, trusted circles narrowed. Dependence on familiar figures increased, not out of weakness, but out of survival. Trust became precious, scarce, and carefully guarded. Those admitted into confidence bore immense responsibility. Their influence grew not through ambition alone, but through proximity to a silence few others could endure. The court understood this dynamic. Power shifted subtly through access rather than decree. Influence was exercised in whispers, not proclamations. The Queen listened closely, yet spoke sparingly. Decisions were often the product of filtered counsel rather than open debate. Transparency threatened stability. Opacity preserved it. The empire's moral contradictions pressed inward. Prosperity rested on suffering unseen by most. Authority required complicity in systems that could not withstand scrutiny if fully illuminated. Silence again became the solution. Not denial, but selective attention. Not ignorance, but containment. The Queen bore these contradictions quietly, rarely expressing conflict aloud. Over time, emotional restraint hardened into habit. The private self adapted, shrinking to fit the demands placed upon it. Feelings were managed rather than explored. Reflection was functional, not restorative. The crown did not allow for inward wandering. There was always another report, another ceremony, another obligation waiting. The myth of maternal authority deepened. She was portrayed as the steady guardian of the nation, a figure beyond ordinary vulnerability. This image comforted millions, but it also erased her humanity. The more symbolic she became, the less room remained for personal truth. Symbols do not confess doubt. The cost of this transformation was subtle but profound. Relationships became defined by function. Emotions became regulated responses. The inner life grew quieter, not peaceful, but constrained. Silence ceased to be merely protective, it became defining. The Queen no longer simply practiced restraint, she embodied it. Yet beneath this stillness, tension persisted. The effort to maintain control required constant vigilance. Any sign of weakness risked destabilization, not only of her authority, but of the identity she had constructed to survive it. The fear was not of rebellion alone, but of exposure. Exposure threatened collapse, not because she lacked strength, but because the structure supporting her depended on illusion. The illusion of effortless authority, the illusion of emotional distance. To acknowledge the strain would be to admit fragility where none was permitted. And so the silence continued, reinforced by success, praised by observers, internalized by the Queen herself. But silence, once internalized, does not remain neutral. It shapes perception, alters priorities, and distorts judgment. The private world, sealed so carefully, began to exert its own pressure. A question lingered unspoken. How long could control substitute for connection? How long could restraint replace release? The crown had demanded obedience, and it had been given without hesitation. But obedience does not resolve in a conflict. It only delays its reckoning. The first signs of strain were almost imperceptible. A withdrawal here, a rigidity there, small adjustments that seemed practical at the time. Few noticed, fewer questioned. The image remained intact. The empire remained confident. But beneath the polished surface, the private world had grown dangerously narrow. And when a life becomes defined by containment, even a minor disruption can threaten to break what has been held together for too long. The discipline that once protected her authority began to shape her instincts. Control was no longer something she applied only to the world around her. It governed her inner responses as well. Emotion was assessed before it was felt. Reaction was delayed until it could be rendered acceptable. This was not coldness. It was adaptation. A ruler who reacted too freely risked more than embarrassment. She risked destabilizing the fragile equilibrium that surrounded the crown. The court rewarded this adaptation. Predictability was valued above honesty. Those who could anticipate her preferences prospered. Those who challenged her assumptions did so cautiously, often at personal cost. Over time, dissent softened. Agreement became the safest form of loyalty. The queen listened, but increasingly within narrow boundaries defined by trust and habit rather than debate. Power creates its own gravity. It draws agreement inward and pushes contradiction away. The queen's position meant she was rarely contradicted directly, even when disagreement existed, it arrived filtered, framed carefully to avoid discomfort. This insulation was meant to preserve clarity, yet it carried its own danger. Decisions made without friction can drift away from reality without immediate resistance. The private world responded by tightening further. Certainty became a refuge. Familiar patterns were reinforced. Advisors who confirmed her instincts gained influence, not because of manipulation alone, but because reassurance felt safer than uncertainty. The pressure to be correct was constant. Admitting doubt invited scrutiny. Maintaining confidence preserved order. The image of moral authority deepened alongside this inward turn. The public saw restraint as virtue and silence as wisdom. She was praised for consistency, for an unyielding sense of duty that seemed untouched by personal desire. This praise reinforced the behavior, even as it narrowed the space in which she could exist honestly. Yet moral authority carries contradiction. It demands judgment without vulnerability. It requires decisions that affect millions while discouraging visible struggle. The queen bore these contradictions quietly. The empire's reach expanded. Its consequences multiplied. Responsibility increased without a corresponding outlet for reflection or release. Within the palace, emotional expression became increasingly coded. Affection was demonstrated through routine rather than spontaneity. Loyalty was affirmed through service rather than speech. Even moments of closeness were shaped by formality. This structure provided safety, but it also prevented genuine intimacy from fully developing. Isolation did not arrive through abandonment. It emerged through proximity without connection. The queen was rarely alone physically, yet often untouched emotionally. Surrounded by attendants, advisors, and officials, she occupied a space few could enter without permission. The barriers were not solely architectural. They were psychological, reinforced daily by expectation. The pressure of legacy began to weigh more heavily. Each decision was understood as precedent. Each action would be interpreted long after it was taken. The queen did not merely govern the present, she curated memory. This awareness intensified restraint. Mistakes could not be easily corrected. Silence felt safer than risk. Control extended into personal identity. The role consumed the person so thoroughly that separation became difficult. The queen did not simply perform authority, she lived within it. Even private thought was influenced by public consequence. The mind learned to censor itself before others could. The court observed these shifts, though rarely named them. Loyalty adapted to rigidity. Obedience deepened. The system functioned smoothly, yet something essential was slowly eroding. When disagreement disappears, so does the opportunity for correction. Stability becomes brittle. The Queen's fear was not irrational. History had taught her the cost of perceived weakness. Monarchs who hesitated invited challenge. Those who exposed uncertainty were judged harshly. She had learned from observation and from instinct that authority must appear seamless. The performance could not pause, even when the performer faltered. Private moments became increasingly occupied by reflection that circled rather than resolved. Thoughts returned to the same concerns repeatedly, unable to move forward without risk. Control prevented collapse, but it also prevented healing. Silence preserved order, but it did not provide relief. The empire continued to project confidence. Expansion, industry, and ceremony reinforced the illusion of strength. Yet the cost of this confidence remained concentrated within a single figure. The Queen absorbed tension without release, expectation without reprieve. The role demanded endurance beyond ordinary limits. As years passed, rigidity replaced flexibility. Adaptation slowed. The world changed faster than the structures that governed her responses. New social pressures emerged, challenging traditional authority in ways silence could no longer fully contain. The Queen sensed this shift, even if she did not openly acknowledge it. Control, once a source of safety, began to generate anxiety. The effort required to maintain it increased. Small disruptions felt threatening. Uncertainty provoked defensiveness rather than curiosity. The private world, long contained, pressed outward against its boundaries. Those closest to her felt the shift. Access became more restricted, decisions hardened, emotional distance increased. The Queen's authority remained intact, but it grew heavier, more solitary. Power isolated not through excess, but through accumulation. The myth persisted. The public image remained composed, resolute, maternal. Few questioned the cost of such consistency. Fewer still considered what happened when restraint ceased to be a choice and became a necessity. The silence that once protected now concealed. Fragility, the habits that preserved order now limited resilience. A structure built entirely on control leaves little room for adaptation when strain exceeds capacity. And strain was building, quietly, steadily, beneath layers of ritual and expectation. The private world, so carefully sealed, was approaching a moment when containment alone would no longer suffice. Something unresolved pressed closer to the surface, waiting for an opportunity to emerge. The moment when containment fails is rarely dramatic at first. It begins as fatigue mistaken for discipline, as caution interpreted as wisdom. The Queen's routines continued uninterrupted, yet the effort behind them increased. What once felt deliberate now felt necessary. Control was no longer a tool she could set aside. It had become the structure holding everything upright. Her inner world responded by narrowing further. Complexity was reduced wherever possible. Ambiguity became intolerable. Decisions favored certainty over nuance, familiarity over innovation. This was not stubbornness alone. It was protection. When emotional capacity is stretched thin, the mind seeks stability wherever it can find it. The court mirrored this shift. Advisors adjusted their language, anticipating resistance to change. Proposals were shaped to align with established preferences. Risk was softened before presentation. This adaptation preserved harmony, yet it also reinforced rigidity. The Queen received fewer challenges not because disagreement vanished, but because it became impractical. Authority thrives on clarity, but clarity without contradiction drifts toward isolation. The Queen's confidence appeared unbroken, yet it rested increasingly on repetition rather than renewal. Past decisions justified present ones. Tradition became evidence. The weight of precedent replaced deliberation. The private cost deepened quietly. Emotional responses dulled not through indifference, but through overuse. When feeling must always be controlled, it eventually withdraws. The queen did not lose the capacity for emotion, she lost the permission to experience it freely. Joy, frustration, grief, all were processed through restraint before being allowed expression. Public appearances continued to reassure. Her presence still commanded respect. Crowds still saw continuity. The image functioned as designed, yet the performance required more preparation, more recovery, more silence afterward. The effort was invisible but cumulative. Within the palace, the atmosphere subtly shifted. Interactions grew more formal, spontaneity diminished. Even trusted relationships felt increasingly constrained by caution. The queen remained respected, yet emotionally distant. This distance was interpreted as dignity, reinforcing the cycle that produced it. The empire's demands did not pause. Reports arrived detailing unrest, inequality, moral compromise. Each required acknowledgement, yet few allowed resolution. The queen absorbed these realities without outward reaction. Silence once again served as containment, but containment does not erase knowledge. It merely postpones its reckoning. The question of legacy pressed closer. History loomed not as abstraction, but as judgment. How would her reign be remembered? What would remain when ceremony faded? This awareness intensified caution. Mistakes would be permanent. Silence felt safer than misstep. The private self adapted by withdrawing further from uncertainty. Reflection narrowed. Emotional range compressed. The queen did not collapse under pressure. She reorganized herself around it. This adaptation preserved function, but at the cost of flexibility. Control extended into memory. Certain thoughts were avoided. Certain emotions were postponed indefinitely. The mind learned which paths led to discomfort and quietly blocked them. Over time, these internal boundaries hardened, shaping perception itself. The court rarely named this transformation. To do so would require confronting the limits of authority. Instead, it responded with increased deference. Distance became respect. Silence became loyalty. The system reinforced itself, efficient and unchallenged. The queen's fear was not of rebellion alone, but of dissolution. The structure she inhabited depended on her stability. Any visible fracture threatened not only her position, but the confidence of the empire itself. The burden of continuity rested heavily on her shoulders. Private moments grew quieter, not peaceful, but constrained. The absence of emotional expression did not bring calm, it brought stillness without relief. The mind circled familiar concerns, unable to move beyond them without risking exposure. Control, once empowering, now demanded constant reinforcement. Small uncertainties provoked disproportionate anxiety. Minor disruptions felt threatening. The effort to maintain equilibrium increased as resilience decreased. Those closest sensed the tension. Access became more limited. Emotional exchanges shortened. The queen remained decisive, yet less open. Authority persisted, but warmth diminished. The private world contracted further, becoming increasingly self-contained. The myth of maternal stability endured. The public continued to project reassurance onto her presence. Few questioned the emotional cost of such endurance. Fewer still considered what happens when restraint replaces connection entirely. The silence that once preserved order now obscured vulnerability. The habits that sustained authority now constrained adaptation. A system built on containment cannot expand without strain. And strain was no longer theoretical. It manifested in subtle shifts, rigidity where flexibility once existed, withdrawal where engagement had been possible. The queen's private world, long disciplined into silence, was approaching a threshold. Something within her recognized this change, even if it remained unspoken. The balance she had maintained for decades was becoming increasingly fragile. Control could delay reckoning, but it could not prevent it indefinitely. The first true test would not arrive through public challenge or political crisis. It would emerge from within, where authority offered no protection. And when it did, the silence that had sustained her might no longer be enough to hold everything together. The internal reckoning did not announce itself with panic or confession. It arrived as a tightening, a sense that the familiar mechanisms no longer delivered the same reassurance. The Queen continued to function flawlessly, yet the effort required felt heavier, more deliberate. What had once been instinctive now demanded constant attention. Authority remained intact, but ease had vanished. The private hours became more difficult to inhabit. Silence, once a refuge, grew crowded with unresolved thought. The mind, trained to contain rather than explore, revisited the same concerns without resolution. Control prevented emotional overflow, but it also prevented relief. The discipline that preserved order began to feel indistinguishable from confinement. Her relationship with time shifted. The future felt less expansive, more burdened by consequence. Each remaining decision seemed weighted not only by immediate impact, but by finality. The past pressed forward, demanding coherence. The Queen was no longer simply governing a present moment, she was managing an ending she could not yet define. The court sensed the shift without naming it. Routines hardened. Familiar faces became increasingly important. New voices were treated with caution. Change felt intrusive. Stability required reinforcement. What had once been flexibility now felt like risk. Emotional expression continued to narrow. Reactions were filtered quickly, sometimes before they fully formed. The Queen did not suppress feeling through force, she bypassed it through habit. The result was efficiency without nourishment. The inner life survived, but it no longer expanded. Public expectations intensified rather than eased. Longevity magnified symbolism. Each appearance carried accumulated meaning. The Queen's endurance became proof of national resilience. The longer she remained composed, the more necessary that composure appeared. The image fed itself. Private suffering rarely disrupts power directly, it erodes it quietly. The Queen's authority did not waver, yet her tolerance for complexity diminished. Decisions favored predictability. Ambiguity was resolved quickly, sometimes prematurely. The desire for closure outweighed the value of exploration. The empire's contradictions grew sharper. Moral certainty was increasingly difficult to maintain amid expanding responsibility. Silence remained the preferred response, not because issues lacked importance, but because engagement threatened equilibrium. To acknowledge complexity openly would invite instability. Containment once again prevailed. Within the palace, emotional distance increased subtly. Interactions became shorter, more purposeful. Intimacy was replaced by routine. The Queen remained respected, yet less approachable. The separation was not enforced, it was accepted as necessary. Memory itself became selective. Certain losses were acknowledged publicly, yet processed privately without articulation. Grief moved inward rather than outward. Without expression, it altered behavior rather than resolving. The Queen did not dwell visibly on loss, but it shaped her caution, her attachment to familiarity, her resistance to change. The pressure of example intensified. Every action was watched for implication. The Queen was not merely an individual, she was a template. Deviations carried symbolic risk. Personal needs receded further behind institutional necessity. The private world responded by simplifying. Emotional priorities narrowed. Control remained the guiding principle, yet simplicity came at a cost. When complexity is removed, so too is adaptability. The system functioned smoothly, but it became brittle. The Queen's awareness of this brittleness surfaced occasionally, fleetingly. Moments of recognition appeared and disappeared without resolution. To confront them fully would require disruption she could not permit. Awareness was acknowledged only insofar as it did not demand change. Public admiration persisted. The myth of unwavering authority remained persuasive. Few questioned the sustainability of such endurance. The absence of visible weakness was interpreted as strength rather than suppression. The private toll deepened quietly. Fatigue manifested not as collapse, but as narrowing focus. Interests outside duty diminished. Curiosity receded. The inner landscape grew orderly, sparse, contained. Those closest to her felt the contraction. Access was increasingly regulated. Emotional exchanges became cautious. The Queen remained decisive, yet guarded. Authority endured, but warmth was rationed. Control extended even into rest. Leisure was structured. Silence was managed. The mind rarely wandered freely. Without space for unguarded thought, tension accumulated without release. The Queen's fear was not dramatic. It was persistent. A low awareness that the structure sustaining her required constant maintenance, that any lapse, however small, could expose fragility beneath decades of composure. The system surrounding her reinforced this vigilance. Loyalty expressed itself through agreement, stability through repetition. The absence of challenge felt reassuring, yet it masked vulnerability. Without friction, pressure builds unnoticed. The private world had become efficient, disciplined, and constrained. It functioned as designed, yet it no longer offered restoration. Control preserved authority, but it did not sustain vitality. A subtle question lingered beneath routine. What happens when endurance outlasts renewal? When restraint becomes permanent? When silence replaces connection entirely? The answer did not arrive as revelation. It approached slowly, through cumulative strain rather than singular crisis. The balance that had held for so long was shifting imperceptibly, yet decisively. Something essential was thinning, not through failure, but through exhaustion. And when endurance finally reaches its limit, the collapse it prevents may arrive in quieter, more unsettling forms than anyone expects. What emerged next was not rebellion against the role, but a deepening attachment to what felt immovable. When the inner world offers no release, certainty becomes comfort. The Queen leaned more heavily on symbols, routines, and structures that reassured her of continuity. Ritual was no longer merely ceremonial, it was stabilizing. Each repeated action affirmed that something remained unchanged, even as the world beyond pressed forward. The crown itself took on heightened significance, not as ornament, but as anchor. Authority had always defined her existence, yet now it also soothed her unease. To embody the institution was to escape the vulnerability of individuality. The more completely she merged with the role, the less exposed she felt as a person. Power became refuge rather than expression. This fusion came with consequence. When identity collapses into function, flexibility diminishes. The Queen's responses grew more absolute, less open to reinterpretation. Where nuance once existed, principle now stood. Moral certainty hardened, not because it grew clearer, but because ambiguity felt dangerous. The private world demanded simplicity to survive. The court adapted swiftly. Those who thrived were those who reinforced continuity rather than questioned it. Innovation slowed, deference increased. Loyalty was demonstrated through alignment, not discussion. The system grew efficient, but inwardly rigid. Stability was achieved at the cost of responsiveness. Public life reflected this transformation subtly. Appearances became more formal, less spontaneous. The Queen's presence remained commanding, yet increasingly distant. The maternal image persisted, but it took on a solemn quality. Compassion was expressed through duty rather than warmth. The public accepted this without resistance. Reverence rarely demands intimacy. The empire continued its expansion, its contradictions widening alongside its influence. Decisions made far from consequence returned only as abstractions. Responsibility grew heavier, yet remained diffused. The Queen carried the symbolic weight of empire without direct contact with its suffering. Silence once again served as buffer between knowledge and feeling. Private reflection narrowed further. The mind, long trained to suppress uncertainty, began to avoid it altogether. Questions that once lingered were dismissed quickly. Doubt was reframed as threat. Control required vigilance, and vigilance required boundaries. The Queen's emotional economy adjusted accordingly. Attachment concentrated on the familiar. New relationships felt intrusive. Trusted figures became essential not merely for counsel, but for reassurance. The private world grew smaller, safer, and more confined. Grief, unresolved and unspoken, continued to shape behavior. Loss had taught her the danger of emotional exposure. To feel deeply was to risk destabilization. Containment felt preferable to vulnerability. Over time, this preference hardened into rule. The image of endurance intensified. Longevity transformed restraint into legend. The Queen's ability to persist without visible fracture became proof of moral superiority in the public imagination. Few questioned whether endurance without release was sustainable. Fewer still considered its human cost. Within the palace, the atmosphere reflected this myth. Silence was respected. Emotional distance was normalized. Even concern was expressed cautiously. The Queen's authority discouraged inquiry into her well-being. To ask would be to imply fragility where none was permitted. The private toll continued quietly. Fatigue manifested not as collapse, but as narrowing attention. Interests outside governance diminished further. Curiosity yielded to obligation. The inner life remained orderly, yet increasingly sparse. Control extended into perception itself. Events were interpreted through established frameworks rather than explored openly. New information was absorbed selectively. The Queen did not resist reality, she filtered it. This filtering preserved coherence, but it also limited understanding. The fear underlying this adaptation was not irrational. The world was changing rapidly. Social structures shifted. Authority was questioned more openly. The Queen sensed these currents even as she resisted their intrusion. Stability felt threatened not only by external forces, but by internal uncertainty. To maintain equilibrium, she tightened her grip on tradition. Precedent became shield. Continuity became justification. The crown stood not only for power, but for resistance to change. This stance reassured some, unsettled others, and isolated her further. The private world responded with increased vigilance. Any sign of disruption was addressed swiftly. Emotional fluctuation was corrected. The system within her mirrored the system she governed, efficient, controlled, and increasingly intolerant of deviation. Those closest sensed the strain, though they rarely named it. Access became more restricted. Emotional exchanges were brief. The Queen remained composed, yet increasingly distant. Authority endured, but connection thinned. The silence that surrounded her grew denser. It protected her from intrusion, yet also from relief. Without space for unguarded thought, tension accumulated unnoticed. The private world functioned, but it no longer healed. A subtle imbalance emerged between endurance and vitality. The Queen continued to rule, continued to embody stability, yet something essential was being spent faster than it could be restored. Control preserved order, but it did not replenish strength. The myth of permanence concealed this erosion. The public saw continuity and assumed resilience. The institution appeared unshaken. Yet beneath the surface, the private world bore the cost of sustaining an image that allowed no weakness. The question was no longer whether the structure would hold, but how long it could do so without renewal. When identity is sustained solely through endurance, exhaustion becomes inevitable. The reckoning would not arrive through open defiance or public failure. It would come through quiet distortion, through decisions shaped more by fear than by insight, through isolation mistaken for authority, through silence that concealed more than it preserved. The balance that had defined her reign was shifting once again. Control remained, but it was no longer enough. Something within the private world was being strained beyond its capacity to adapt. and the consequences of that strain were beginning to surface, slowly, inexorably, beneath the weight of the crown. As endurance became habit, judgment began to shift in subtle ways. Decisions still emerged from experience and authority, yet their emotional foundation changed. Where confidence once carried curiosity, it now carried caution. The Queen did not fear the world openly, but she anticipated threat instinctively. Every challenge appeared less as an opportunity to adapt and more as a risk to contain. This change rarely announced itself in policy. It revealed itself in tone, in timing, in resistance to deviation. Matters that once invited deliberation were settled more quickly. The desire for closure grew stronger. Unresolved questions felt intolerable. Silence, once a means of protection, became an end in itself. The court reflected this transformation faithfully. Advisors learned to present solutions rather than dilemmas. Complexity was simplified before it reached her. The range of acceptable discussion narrowed without formal decree. The Queen did not demand this contraction explicitly. It emerged naturally from the need to reserve equilibrium. Power, when isolated, becomes self-referential. Without challenge, it turns inward, reinforcing its own logic. The Queen's authority rested on continuity, and continuity required predictability. The unfamiliar felt disruptive. Change, even when necessary, arrived cautiously, diluted by precedent. The private cost of this inward turn deepened. Emotional responses grew more distant, less textured. Compassion remained, but it was expressed through structure rather than connection. Sympathy was translated into policy rather than presence. The human impulse to engage directly with suffering was filtered through obligation. Public admiration continued unabated. The Queen's consistency reassured a society unsettled by transformation. Her restraint was interpreted as wisdom. Her silence was seen as depth. The myth of moral clarity endured, strengthened by longevity. Yet longevity alters perspective. Time compresses priorities. The future feels finite. The weight of accumulated decision grows heavier. Each choice carries not only consequence, but summary. The Queen sensed this burden even as she maintained composure. The private world responded by conserving energy. Emotional investment narrowed further. Relationships were maintained through routine rather than exploration. Familiarity replaced intimacy. The Queen remained surrounded, yet increasingly alone. Memory played a larger role. Past losses resurfaced quietly, shaping present caution. Grief, long contained, did not dissipate. It redirected itself into control. Loss had taught her that vulnerability invites destabilization. Safety lay in restraint. The empire's contradictions pressed inward once more. Expansion brought wealth and suffering in equal measure. Moral certainty became harder to sustain as distance widened between authority and consequence. Silence remained the chosen response, not because of indifference, but because acknowledgement threatened coherence. The Queen's inner dialogue grew more disciplined. Doubt was addressed swiftly, reframed, or dismissed. Emotional discomfort was interpreted as distraction rather than signal. The mind, long trained to manage pressure, continued to do so even as the pressure intensified. The court's loyalty deepened into dependency. Access to the Queen became more tightly controlled. Influence flowed through familiarity rather than argument. This system preserved order, yet it also reduced perspective. Without exposure to challenge, authority risks misalignment with reality. Public rituals continued to reinforce stability. Ceremonies repeated familiar patterns. Symbols remained unchanged. The Queen's presence signaled continuity even as the world beyond shifted. The reassurance was genuine, but it masked growing dissonance. Private fatigue manifested as rigidity. Flexibility required energy she no longer had to spare. Innovation felt taxing. Tradition offered efficiency. The Queen did not resist change out of defiance, but out of exhaustion. The silence surrounding her thickened further. Inquiry into her inner state felt inappropriate. Concern was expressed indirectly, if at all. The Queen's authority discouraged vulnerability not only in herself, but in others. Emotional distance became institutional. The cost of this distance accumulated quietly. Without genuine exchange, understanding narrowed. Without challenge, insight stagnated. The private world functioned smoothly, yet it lacked renewal. Control maintained order, but it did not restore balance. A subtle distortion emerged. Decisions increasingly reflected preservation rather than growth. Stability became priority over justice. Certainty outweighed compassion. These shifts were gradual, almost imperceptible, yet they altered the texture of governance. The Queen remained committed to duty. That commitment never wavered. Yet duty without reflection risks becoming inflexible. The Crown demands continuity, but it does not adapt on its own. Adaptation requires openness, and openness had long been constrained. The fear underlying this rigidity was rarely articulated. It existed as awareness rather than thought, a sense that disruption, once admitted, could not be controlled, that the structure sustaining her might not withstand examination. To prevent this, she maintained distance, distance from uncertainty, distance from vulnerability, distance from herself. The role absorbed the person completely, identity dissolved into function. Public confidence persisted. The myth remained persuasive. Few questioned whether the system surrounding the Queen was still capable of responding to change. The absence of visible crisis was mistaken for resilience. Privately, the cost continued to mount. Emotional reserves thinned. Control demanded constant reinforcement. Silence no longer soothed, it merely contained. The balance between endurance and vitality tipped further. The Queen's authority remained unquestioned, yet it grew heavier, more solitary. Power is olated not through excess, but through accumulation. The longer she endured, the less space remained for renewal. A quiet awareness lingered beneath routine. Something essential had been sacrificed to maintain continuity. The price had been paid gradually, without protest, until it was difficult to remember what had been lost. The reckoning approached not as upheaval, but as distortion, not as rebellion, but as misalignment. The private world, long disciplined into silence, was shaping outcomes in ways no one fully recognized. When endurance becomes the sole measure of strength, vulnerability has no language. And without language, strain expresses itself through consequence rather than confession. The next fracture would not arrive through public failure or political defeat. It would emerge through decision itself, shaped by fear rather than insight, by preservation rather than understanding. The silence that had sustained her reign was no longer neutral. It was beginning to influence outcomes beyond the private world. And once silence begins to govern action, its effects reach far beyond the walls that contain it. When silence begins to shape outcomes, its influence is rarely acknowledged. It operates beneath intention, guiding judgment through avoidance rather than conviction. The Queen's decisions continued to carry authority, yet their foundation shifted further away from engagement and toward insulation. Preservation became instinctive. Risk, even when necessary, felt corrosive. This shift altered the moral texture of power. Authority no longer asked what should be done, but what could be endured without disturbance. The difference was subtle but consequential. Compassion remained present in principle, yet it was increasingly mediated by distance. Responsibility was acknowledged, yet rarely confronted directly. The private world absorbed these tensions without protest. It had been trained to do so. Years of restraint had created an inner structure capable of holding contradiction without expression. The cost of that capability, however, was responsiveness. When feeling is contained long enough, it loses urgency. Concern becomes abstract. Urgency fades into procedure. The The queen did not abandon conscience, she reorganized it. Ethical conflict was resolved through delegation, delay, or silence. These were not acts of neglect, but of survival. The system surrounding her reinforced this approach, translating moral discomfort into manageable forms that preserved equilibrium. The court's language adjusted accordingly. Difficult matters were framed as administrative challenges rather than human crises. Emotion was replaced by process. The queen received clarity without proximity. This clarity supported decisiveness, yet it obscured consequence. Public confidence persisted. The empire continued to see in her a figure of certainty. The absence of visible doubt reassured a society grappling with change. Stability, even when rigid, felt preferable to uncertainty. The myth endured because it answered a collective need. Privately, the queen's emotional landscape grew increasingly muted. Feeling did not disappear, it flattened. Peaks and valleys gave way to steady containment. This emotional leveling reduced volatility, but it also reduced sensitivity. The inner world became predictable, controlled, and limited. Time intensified this condition. Longevity transformed adaptation into identity. What had once been strategy became character. The queen no longer consciously chose restraint, she inhabited it. Alternatives felt foreign, even dangerous. The empire's expanding complexity challenged this inward turn. New social pressures demanded response rather than repetition. Authority faced questions it could no longer silence entirely. The queen sensed this tension even as she resisted its intrusion. Change threatened not only tradition, but the fragile balance sustaining her inner world. Control tightened once more. Familiar structures were reinforced. Symbolism was emphasized. The crown stood as reassurance against uncertainty. To embody permanence was to deny fragility. The queen leaned into this embodiment fully. Those around her followed suit. Innovation slowed further. Debate narrowed. Loyalty expressed itself through agreement. The system functioned smoothly, yet it grew increasingly disconnected from lived reality. Distance replaced dialogue. The private cost deepened. Emotional energy was conserved ruthlessly. Engagement beyond duty diminished. Curiosity receded. The queen remained alert, yet inwardly constrained. Silence was no longer restful, it was compulsory. Grief, long unresolved, continued to shape perception. Loss had taught her that attachment invites vulnerability. Vulnerability invites disruption. To avoid disruption, attachment was limited. The queen loved through structure rather than closeness, through duty rather than exposure. Public rituals reinforced this pattern. Ceremonies repeated familiar forms, reaffirming continuity. The queen's presence still commanded reverence. Few noticed how ritual had replaced connection, how repetition had supplanted renewal. The court mirrored her discipline. Emotional expression was subdued. Concern was expressed indirectly. The queen's authority discouraged inquiry into her inner state. To ask would be to question the myth. The silence surrounding her became increasingly performative. It signaled strength, yet concealed depletion. The absence of visible strain reassured observers, but it prevented recognition of accumulated cost. Decision-making reflected this depletion. Choices favored containment over engagement, preservation over exploration. These decisions did not appear wrong, they appeared safe. Yet safety, when prioritized exclusively, limits possibility. The queen's fear was not dramatic, it was persistent and unspoken. A quiet awareness that the structure sustaining her required constant maintenance, that any genuine disruption might expose fragility long concealed. To prevent exposure, distance was maintained, distance from dissent, distance from complexity, distance from emotion. The role absorbed the person entirely. The queen existed as function rather than self. Public confidence remained intact. The empire continued to project stability through her presence. Few questioned whether stability without renewal could endure indefinitely. The absence of crisis was mistaken for health. Privately, the consequences accumulated. Emotional reserves thinned further. Control demanded increasing effort. Silence no longer soothed, it constrained. The balance between endurance and vitality tipped decisively. The Queen's authority remained unchallenged, yet it felt heavier, more solitary. Power isolated not through excess, but through duration. The longer she endured, the more complete the isolation became. A quiet recognition surfaced occasionally, fleeting and unspoken. Something essential had been sacrificed to sustain continuity. The loss had occurred gradually, without resistance, until it felt irreversible. The reckoning did not announce itself through rebellion or scandal. It approached through distortion, through decisions shaped more by fear than insight, through isolation mistaken for strength, through silence that concealed more than it preserved. The private world, long disciplined into containment, was now shaping outcomes beyond itself. The effects of that shaping were subtle but far-reaching. Silence had crossed a threshold. It was no longer merely personal. And once silence begins to govern power, its consequences extend beyond intention. They settle into legacy, altering not only what is done, but how it is remembered. The crown remained secure, the image endured, yet beneath the surface, something vital had shifted. The cost of the crown was no longer confined to the private world. It was beginning to imprint itself upon the empire it sustained. The consequences of long-contained fear rarely appear where observers expect them. They do not erupt in spectacle or confession. They surface through adjustment, through recalibration so gradual it appears reasonable at each step. The Queen's authority remained intact, yet the shape of its exercise shifted. Decisions were increasingly designed to prevent disturbance rather than to confront reality. Stability became the measure by which all choices were weighed. This shift altered the relationship between power and responsibility. Governance continued with precision, yet moral engagement thinned. Issues that threatened equilibrium were deferred, reframed, or absorbed into procedure. The Queen did not deny complexity, she neutralized it. What could not be resolved was managed into quiet persistence. The private world supported this approach instinctively. It had long been conditioned to contain discomfort. Emotional signals that once prompted reflection were now interpreted as threats to order. The mind moved quickly to suppress them. Control, refined over decades, responded automatically. The court reinforced this rhythm. Advisors anticipated resistance to disruption and shaped counsel accordingly. The Queen received information designed to reassure rather than unsettle. This was not deception, it was adaptation. The system prioritized continuity, and continuity required calm. Public life continued uninterrupted. Ceremonies followed established patterns. The Queen's presence still conveyed certainty. To the outside world, endurance remained proof of strength. Few questioned the cost of such consistency. Fewer still asked whether endurance had begun to replace judgment. Privately, the strain manifested as narrowing tolerance. Ambiguity felt intrusive. Prolonged deliberation felt draining. The Queen favored resolution, even when resolution simplified complexity beyond recognition. Closure offered relief where reflection demanded energy. This preference subtly reshaped governance. Preservation overtook reform. Tradition justified restraint. The familiar felt safe. Change, when unavoidable, was introduced cautiously, stripped of its unsettling edges. Progress was permitted only insofar as it did not disturb the image of continuity. The emotional economy of the private world grew increasingly austere. Feelings were acknowledged briefly, then set aside. Reflection became functional rather than restorative. The Queen remained capable of compassion, yet its expression was mediated by structure. Sympathy traveled through policy, not presence. The empire's moral weight continued to accumulate. Decisions made at distance returned only as abstraction. Responsibility was dispersed across systems that absorbed blame without resolution. Silence once again served as buffer between authority and consequence. The Queen sensed the growing distance, even if she did not articulate it. Awareness surfaced occasionally, fleeting and unsettling. It was quickly contained. To dwell on it would invite questions without answers. Control intervened, restoring order. The court's deference deepened. Access narrowed. Influence consolidated around familiarity. The Queen remained decisive, yet increasingly insulated. The absence of challenge felt reassuring, yet it concealed misalignment between authority and lived reality. Public admiration intensified as longevity increased. The Queen's endurance became emblematic. Her restraint was celebrated as moral clarity. The myth hardened further, leaving little room for reinterpretation. Symbols do not evolve easily. Privately, fatigue continued to accumulate, not physical exhaustion, but emotional depletion. The energy required to maintain composure increased as reserves diminished. Silence no longer replenished, it merely postponed reckoning. Control extended into anticipation. Potential disruptions were addressed before they emerged. The Queen's instincts favored prevention over engagement. This vigilance preserved stability, yet it also reduced responsiveness. When everything is treated as threat, possibility disappears. The cost of this vigilance was subtle distortion. Decisions shaped by fear do not announce themselves as such. They appear prudent, they feel responsible, yet over time, they accumulate consequences that cannot be traced to a single moment. The private world adapted by further contraction. Emotional range narrowed. Attention focused on essentials. Anything beyond duty felt excessive. The Queen remained present, yet inwardly diminished. The court mirrored this contraction. Emotional expression became minimal. Concern was expressed indirectly. The Queen's authority discouraged inquiry into her well-being. To ask would be to challenge the myth of inexhaustible endurance. Public rituals reinforced this myth relentlessly. Each appearance reaffirmed continuity. Each ceremony suggested permanence. The Queen embodied stability so completely that change itself seemed to orbit her rather than confront her. Yet permanence is illusion sustained through effort. The effort was invisible but constant. The Queen's private world bore the cost without acknowledgement. Silence absorbed strain until it became structure. The reckoning, when it approached, did not resemble collapse. It took the form of legacy. The realization that decisions shaped by containment would outlive the conditions that produced them. That silence would be remembered as intention. The Queen understood legacy intimately. She curated it carefully. Yet the private influence of fear complicated that curation. Outcomes shaped by avoidance would be interpreted as conviction. Distance would be mistaken for resolve. The question lingered beneath routine: what would remain when endurance ended? Not in memory, but in consequence. What patterns would persist because they had never been challenged? The private world had long been disciplined into obedience. It had preserved authority faithfully. Yet in doing so, it had reshaped judgment itself. Control had not failed. It had succeeded too thoroughly. The final cost of the crown was not collapse, nor scandal, nor rebellion. It was distortion, quiet, cumulative, and enduring. The imprint of long-contained fear upon decisions that would define memory rather than moment. As the reign approached its final phase, the balance between preservation and understanding grew increasingly fragile. The Queen remained composed. The image endured. Yet beneath the surface, the legacy was already being shaped by choices made in silence. The next fracture would not reveal itself through crisis, but through interpretation, through how history would read restraint, through how absence would be explained. through how silence would be remembered not as protection, but as decision. And once memory takes form, it cannot be governed by the crown that created it. When authority passes into memory, it loses the protection of intention. Actions are no longer defended by context or necessity. Silence, once strategic, becomes ambiguous. What was withheld is judged alongside what was declared. The Queen's reign, preserved so carefully in image, entered this final transformation quietly, without announcement. The private world, long disciplined into containment, did not loosen as the end approached. Habits formed over decades do not dissolve easily. Control remained instinctive. Restraint persisted. Even as physical endurance waned, emotional discipline held firm. The crown was never set aside internally, even when its weight grew heavier. Public life continued to reflect continuity, appearances reassured, rituals repeated. The empire still saw stability in her presence, yet the distance between symbol and person widened further. The Queen had become almost entirely representational. The individual beneath the role receded into silence. The court adapted once more. Attention shifted subtly toward succession, toward future alignment. Loyalty remained, yet its orientation changed. The Queen sensed this transition without remark. Power does not vanish suddenly. It thins, redistributes, prepares to move on. Privately, reflection grew quieter rather than deeper. There was no dramatic reckoning, no unburdening confession. The inner world remained ordered, contained, disciplined. Questions surfaced occasionally, then dissolved into habit. Control did not allow for retrospective vulnerability. The cost of this discipline became visible only in absence. What was never spoken could not be clarified. What was never challenged could not be corrected. The private world, sealed so thoroughly, left little trace of emotional truth for history to examine. Legacy took shape without consultation. Observers interpreted restraint as certainty. Distance became dignity. Silence was read as moral authority. The myth persisted, reinforced by the absence of contradiction. Symbols filled the space where human complexity might have appeared. Yet consequences remained. Decisions shaped by containment endured beyond their context. Policies hardened into precedent. Patterns established to preserve equilibrium continued without their original necessity. Silence echoed forward, influencing interpretation long after its purpose had faded. The Queen's humanity, carefully guarded, became increasingly inaccessible. Historians would search for motivation, for inner conflict, for clarity. They would find structure, discipline, and restraint. What they would not find easily was expression. This absence shaped memory as much as action. Without articulated doubt, conviction appeared absolute. Without visible struggle, choices seemed effortless. The crown's demand for perfection succeeded too well. It erased the evidence of cost. The private suffering that sustained public stability remained largely invisible. Isolation, fear, and restraint did not leave records. They altered behavior rather than words. Their imprint lay not in confession, but in outcome. The end of the reign did not bring resolution. It brought closure without explanation. The image remained intact. The institution endured. The private world dissolved quietly, leaving behind a structure shaped by decades of silence. The final tragedy was not personal collapse. It was the erasure of complexity. A life governed by power and expectation left little room for ambiguity to survive. The human being was absorbed into the symbol completely. What remains is a legacy defined by endurance, stability preserved at immense cost, authority maintained through restraint, silence wielded as control. The unanswered questions linger not because they were unimportant, but because they were never permitted full voice. The crown succeeded in its purpose. The empire endured. Order was maintained. Yet the price was paid privately, steadily, without acknowledgement. In the end, the darkest aspect of the private world was not obsession, or fear alone. It was the necessity of silence itself, the requirement to contain humanity so completely that nothing remained to contradict the myth. History would remember the image, the ceremonies, the continuity. What it would struggle to recover was the interior life shaped by pressure, expectation, and restraint. The crown demands endurance. It does not reward vulnerability, and when silence becomes survival, it leaves behind a legacy that feels complete, yet remains unfinished. That is the cost of absolute authority, not rebellion, not scandal, but a life lived so carefully that its deepest truths disappear into the quiet they were built to protect.